All right, welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm here with the recently refreshed, coffee drinking, wild hair donning. By the way, jealous, given the state of my system here. Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, you're back. You're back in Atlanta. It's cooler here than you're used to. How's it going?
I'm back in Atlanta. It was a long 11-hour drive back from Bentonville, Arkansas, but I'm here. I'm excited about talking today. I know our topic or topics, I think they're worthwhile. And what an interesting time 6 games into the season to be talking about some of this.
Yeah, what's really interesting is when I watch the games now, because I think about like what you and I are going to talk about every week, and I think um I've been watching Denver, right? Last Thursday night they played Kansas City. They actually had a better defensive performance than normal, but for the most part, they've really struggled. Um I look at the contrast between where Denver is now versus where Denver was a season ago, and I can't help but ask the question because you've been a part of transitions across the league, right? You took over in Atlanta in 2008. You let go of Mike Smith, went with Dan Quinn in 2015, and most of those transitions were pretty clean, right? Where a new guy comes in, gets to bring in his own staff, and the transition kind of you go from kind of one philosophy to another. Denver kind of did a similar thing. And what was really interesting was Ejiro Evero, who was the defensive coordinator for Denver last year and was the architect of a defense that, for the most part, I think many people were okay with in Denver, and was one of the reasons why I think some teams were actually like fairly okay with, betting into Denver a little bit this year. He actually left and went to Carolina. And Denver's defense has been one of the worst in football since now that Vance Joseph has come in and been the defensive coordinator, even though personnel has largely stayed the same. I'm going to bring up, at Sumer Sports, by the way, sumersports.com. I'm going to bring up a few of our league tables, just kind of looking at the defensive table here. This is from 2022. So last season, San Francisco, Dallas, your former head coach, Dan Quinn, New England, your former boss, Bill Belichick. But notice here, Denver was, more or less, a top 10 defense in the NFL last year. And this was with giving up 50 points on Christmas to an LA Rams team, by the time that they were eliminated from the playoffs. Pretty good in terms of EPA per pass as well. Another top 10 mark. EPA per rush a little bit down, but again, passing is kind of more, what it means to play defense now. And when you look at this season, Thomas, 2023, Denver is all the way down on the bottom here. And when you look at, EPA per pass, similarly all the way down on the bottom. And, I can't help but think, with that, I think a big reason for that is the change of defensive coordinator. And so one question I wanted to have and to discuss here is because we're going to be talking about over the next few months changes that are possibly taking place. There have already been rumors about Chicago making changes. There are already rumors, we even talked about New England last week. And again, nothing's set in stone. We're not, hoping that any of these changes happen. But when they do, what are the politics involved with, people that are existing there? What are the politics with incumbent people that have value to an organization?
So it's a great question. I think it's a great topic. Let's, start by saying I would suggest probably anytime a new head coach comes in and a new regime. I mean, I came in at one time with a new head coach, and then another time we hired a new head coach. My feeling is it's, more than 75% turnover, maybe even more, maybe 80+% turnover, 85% in most teams. You rarely are keeping people on your staff. Just the basic reason for that many times is a head coach comes in and he may know people on that staff. Chances are he knows quite a few people, but they're not in his system. They haven't been around him. He doesn't have a trust factor in them. That's a big thing, right? People think, oh, why wouldn't they just take the best coaches? Which is something that I want to talk to you about and I want to fold into here, because the smart coaching staffs don't just come in and wipe everyone out because they don't have their loyalists on this staff, right? let's really dig in and let's be smart. Let's sit down with the owner and the general manager and the head coach, and let's really talk about the coaching staff that the new coaching staff will be bringing in, right? To your point, let's really dig down and decide this is more than just having the people you like having beer with or coffee with or whatever it is, or the trusting people. Let's make sure you have the best coaches on your staff to help you win. So it is very political.
Yeah, it's so hard. And like this isn't, our experiences are just our experiences. But I will say, when I was in college, Thomas, Division II, Minnesota State, same school that Mark Trestman played at. In my 4 years there, we had 3 head coaches and 4 offensive coordinators. We had a longtime guy who had been there for 30 years who got fired my first year. We had a guy that stayed for 1 year, and then the last 2 years were the same guy who had some success. And what was really funny was when the new guy took over, it was a full search, right? It was a full-on search, and because they hadn't had a search in forever, they had to maintain 2 coaches that ran the off-season program. And it was 2 coaches, and those guys, because they held over, they got some privileges that some of the coaches that the new guy brought in weren't able to get, and they had promises in theory. And when they didn't produce, one of them was the offensive coordinator. When they didn't produce, they got kind of kicked out. And one of the, you overhear these things. It's like, well, I changed my entire career to stay here and run your offense, and it's just like, well, why was that necessary to do in the first place? To your point, Thomas, there's just so much in the way. So on one end, you could have this, okay, we can keep people here, but they're working through a system that isn't theirs, because if it was theirs, they would have been with the coach in the first place. And yet at the same time, there are, like, I call it systemic knowledge, right? Or systematic knowledge of the existing place as well, like how things work with the owner, how things how Sundays work, all that kind of stuff that is valuable. And I think you do want to measure those things, because to your point, on the other side, like, you have coaches that will come with a guy for years and years and years, and you've talked about that before, and you're not going to name names, but there have been guys that clearly hold the coaching staff back, where the guy is there because he's just been there the whole time. He's part of the crew. How do you, because I think it's really tough, because you want to inject new ideas, but I think the time to inject new ideas is maybe in the process of the coaching staff already being there, if that makes sense. So Sean Payton takes over in Denver. He brings all of his own guys, and then 2 or 3 years in, he shakes it up a little bit and brings in new people, as opposed to holding in incumbents. Because, I mean, we see this in business all the time. When incentives aren't aligned and when time periods aren't aligned, there can often be situations where one person is working in their own interest, and it ruins the value of the group as a whole.
Yeah, and think about this. I mean, when a coaching staff, or portions of a coaching staff are retained and a new head coach comes in, make no mistake about it, Eric. I mean, these new head coaches, I don't care how confident they are, and you're talking about Sean Payton, one of the most confident out there. He does care about the relationships of these coaches, not only with the owner, right? I'm talking about, could be coordinator, position coaches that have been on a staff for 5 or 6 years, or 3 or 4. And then they also have a relationship with the personnel department and the general manager, potentially, if it's a holdover general manager. This is tough for a head coach, right? Because a head coach doesn't want to come in here having to climb up the tree to gain credibility. And there are already some holdovers who potentially are walking down the hall and hanging out in the general manager's office or the personnel director's office. It sounds odd, but it happens. They've developed good friendships, and all of a sudden this new head coach is like, I don't need the distraction. I'm not paranoid. I'm not insecure necessarily, but I just don't need the hassle of having this back and forth with former coaches or coaches who stay on board. So just make sure that you keep that in perspective, because it can be a really dicey situation, on top of the fact that some of these position coaches and beyond have been over to the owner's place having dinner with, with someone. Or in our case in Atlanta, Arthur Blank took us to Augusta National 12 times. That coaching staff group that played golf, that came with us, you don't think they had a tie with the owner? So it's just one of those things to talk many levels.
Well, not only that, but also like in the case of Ejiro Evero, like he had a chance to replace Nathaniel Hackett last year and declined. And so you're also looking at sort of like a history with that particular franchise. So even if you wanted to retain him, this is the other part too, is like, I always think about this as way back in the day, but like, when a quarterback loses his starting job, he might take a pay cut and go somewhere else to be a backup, as opposed to staying in the place he lost his starting job for the full salary to be the backup, just because he wants to change the scenery. He doesn't want to be at that place and watch somebody else perform the duties of his old job before. So there's also that too. Like if you're a Ejiro Evero and you're watching last year transpire and you're like, well, they literally just hired this whole staff. Maybe they might just slip me into the head coaching role and just kind of move this thing forward and say Nathaniel Hackett was just a blip. And then they didn't go that direction. And now he's looking at that spot with feelings, and he might just not be fit for that job.
So, yeah, I mean, let's also, I don't want to lose the fact that you brought up Vance Joseph. I mean, Vance Joseph, how many years was he head coach?
Yeah, he was the Denver head coach for 2 years. That's happened. By the way, that's happened more times. So, and granted, it was decades later, but Wade Phillips was the head coach of the Broncos during the John Elway days in '93 and '94. Comes back as DC, at least wins a coordinator or wins a Super Bowl there as a DC, I believe. Gunther Cunningham was the head coach of the Chiefs, came back as defensive coordinator at one point, and then now you have Vance Joseph. The hard part is like with Vance Joseph, there wasn't a ton of success at the head. Like it was a very rough stretch. I mean, we're talking about a guy who only lasted a couple of years there, in a different way that Wade Phillips did, I think. And so now he comes back, and it is awkward, isn't it? Like, and yet I think we're going to see it more as head coaches live longer and obviously like have longer careers.
Oh, look, Vance Joseph in our world, I'm talking about in the NFL, is known as being a really good football guy, right? Things didn't work out at the head coaching job. Maybe sometimes, sometimes it works out, other times it doesn't. And doesn't mean that person is not a good football coach, just for some reason. There could be decisions made. It could be, there are many levels to it. Comes back, you have a guy like Sean Payton who's, offensive through and through. And he's thinking, I can bring in a guy who, wants to come in here. It's for Sean Payton, it is a strong and important underrepresented hire at that position. Mm-hmm. It's a really important move for him. And we talk about this all the time. The league talks about it as well. The underrepresented hires are vital, right? They're vital. We need to get so much better with our head coaching hires. We need to get better with our coordinator hires as well. I mean, and the discussion, I'm sure many of our listeners know, there's a feeling within the league office and amongst the agents and such on the underrepresented hiring side that a lot of defensive coordinators are underrepresented, right? But there's not a pipeline on the offensive coordinator side, right?
Well, and quarterback coach is the big one, right? And the quarterback coach is where
those are the coaches that are going to make their way towards being the head coaches. And what was mentioned the other day, the idea of look, if you're a D coordinator, you don't have as good of a chance to be a head coach in this league. I don't necessarily agree. I just think there needs to be more of a spread. So when people talk about a pipeline, a lot of times the pipeline on the offensive side, it just needs to be more mindful, right? There needs to be a much more mindful approach. And anyway, my point on all of this is Vance is a good football man, and he's in a spot where he probably thought, Sean probably thought would bring him in here, get him back into a spot, shine in that coordinator spot, and then potentially have another opportunity. You never know, right? You just never know. So I like Vance a lot. And I know you guys always think that I'm always taking up for people, but Vance knows football. He really does.
We interviewed him at the Combine in 2020, right before COVID, when I was at PFF for my last podcast. And he was very, it was interesting because at the time he was Arizona's defensive coordinator. And, even without great personnel, like they did, obviously made the playoffs a couple of years ago. He's had some moments in the NFL. And certainly you don't get a chance to be an NFL head coach if you hadn't had moments as a defensive coordinator before. And I think it's interesting because he was not a Sean Payton guy. And it's interesting to this extent of when we're talking about this discussion with Ejiro Evero, another, underrepresented, a person from an underrepresented group. Like, it wasn't even such a thing like he's an incumbent, right? It's not that Sean Payton brought in all of his own guys either, right? It was more like he brought in new people into Denver to change the culture. And it's funny because how much was the culture even changed in the first place with, Nathaniel Hackett's team only being there for a year or so? It's very strange. And it gets me to another idea as well, because we talk about these staggered front office and GM groups, right? Because you have George Payton, right, who joined the Denver Broncos just a couple years ago from Minnesota. He brought over some of his guys from Minnesota. By the way, Minnesota hasn't done great after losing George Payton. So people who want to throw rocks at George Payton's time in Denver, they also don't necessarily look at what Minnesota lost when he left. And now you have kind of this staggered situation where Payton is running the front office type of stuff, and you have Sean Payton, a very strong guy there. How much tension does that have, right? Because we're going to get to Carolina in a second here. How much tension does that have insofar as, Sean Payton coming in, and does he avoid keeping incumbents because he wants, is there a message that's being sent to the front office? Is there there are all these politics that are in place that make for that transition, even though it's exciting because of how much of a career Sean Payton's had in New Orleans and all that. How much does that make a situation tense, and how difficult is that transition period?
So expound on that for 10 more seconds, just so I'm making sure I'm on the same wavelength.
So when Sean Payton comes in, right, and there are existing people there, and that includes people in the front office like George Payton. George Payton did not think when he signed Nathaniel Hackett 18 months ago that he was going to have to replace him with a strong, Hall of Fame caliber coach like Sean Payton, right? So he's kind of caught off guard by this situation too. How much of Sean Payton sort of making a new, switching out coordinators and stuff like that is a message to the George Paytons of the world that there is a power structure here that's like constantly evolving in Denver. Like that's a tough part too. Whereas, for example, when you came in with Mike Smith, you guys were coming in together and it was kind of like, we're building this thing up as a group. That's probably a little cleaner and easier than, the staggeredness of having an existing GM and a new head coach and a head coach that has some strength in Payton.
So remember, everyone, when George Payton came into Denver, he came in as a dude, right? He was what we call, as I've mentioned before, he was final say football guy. He had 53 is what we call it. And then, and I had the same thing. I've mentioned this many times, right? With Mike Smith for the first 7 years in Atlanta, I had final 53. Then when we released Mike Smith and we were going after Dan Quinn, we had to up our ante, right? We had to say, look, we have to give we had to get Dan final football say. He could have gone, his agent, Dan didn't want final football say. He didn't care about it. His agent and Arthur Blank had decided, let's give him final football so that we can cross our T's and dot our I's, and we don't have to get in the middle of negotiating with all these other teams, because that was going to be a big thing. When Sean Payton came in, as I understand, and I don't want to say it's 99.9% sure, that Sean's not coming in as the guy or not the guy. He's coming in as the guy. He is given final football say in the Denver Broncos organization. And George Payton, it's not like he's lost a ton of power, but remember, everyone, someone, head coach or GM, needs to have the final say. So if there's a final pick or a final, decision on something, it has to go to someone. It can't go to the owner. That's ridiculous. That doesn't work. It has to go to one of the head coach or the GM. So Sean Payton comes in. He now has final say. George steps aside a little bit, not steps aside like way down, but he now knows that Sean is the guy that makes those final tough decisions. Remember, I didn't answer to Dan Quinn when Dan Quinn came in, right? We both answered to Arthur Blank, Rich McKay and Arthur Blank, but we answered to Arthur Blank. That's how that worked. Sean Payton comes in with George Payton there as the holdover general manager. They're both answering to Penner, right? And George Payton does not answer directly to Sean Payton. It's an interesting understanding that everyone should be very clear about, because it does add to the precariousness of it, of course.
It is. And it's funny. It's like, and I'm making no value judgment here, but what you said is like what I've heard in sermons my entire life, whereas like everybody gets so mad about the whole biblical thing of like the head of the household and everything. But like ultimately it's, the whole thing, and I don't necessarily agree with this. I don't agree with it, but it's like somebody has to answer to God, right? And it's the same thing. It's like somebody has to answer to the ownership over this sort of, over various decisions that are made across an NFL front office. And that can be tenuous, right? Much like it is in obviously like religious history and stuff too, where people are angry over scriptures for the same thing, because ultimately, and we find this out at Sumer all the time, like it's easier said than done to say we're going to have linear leadership and we're going to build to a consensus, because people have opinions and people have earned those opinions over hard fought, intellectual stimulation and things like that. So it gets tricky, and that's where, I think a lot of these politics, they cannot be ignored in situations like this. And this is where, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, look, this is fascinating. I was right in the middle of this when we changed head coaches and Dan came in. I was so incredibly fortunate that Dan and I kicked it off very well together. We had massive respect for each other out the gate. That said, very interesting when you're talking about your building, right? So I'm going to draw a little bit of a parallel, though George wasn't there as many years as I was before the new head coach came in. But you have people in the building who love George Payton. George Payton is so well known around the league as being a very good football person, solid soul, like all that really good stuff. Sean Payton comes in. All of those guys within the building who had great relationships with George Payton, the general manager, are now kind of tiptoeing around. Really interesting, whether they're holdovers on the football analytics side, or whether they're holdovers on the personnel side, or whether they're holdovers on the trainer side. They are all kind of coming to George directly or indirectly, and hypothetically or not, and saying, look, I love you, George, but I'm really trying to work my relationship with Sean, our new head coach. And it's complicated, right? All of a sudden, there can be some mixed messages within the building. When things aren't going well, do people start swaying towards Sean Payton now because he just got in? And where is George in this? And then George, given who he is, he's an even keel guy. But think about that. That is not easy for George to deal with all this up and down, with people throwing darts certain ways within the building, outside the building, the media, the fan base. It's pretty up and down in that fan base, as I understand. Of course, I have some really good friends over there and contacts in the Denver area, and it's not easy. So all I'm saying, that adds to even more disarray, that it is really up to George as a GM and Sean to navigate through all of that. And then they have the quarterback situation. They have the people that they're trading. You talk about Chicago having a lot of stuff. What Denver's dealing with is a really, really complicated.
Well, they just traded Randy Gregory to the Niners. They just cut Frank Clark outright after Frank decided to take a $1.5 million pay cut to leave. He's apparently on his way back to Kansas City. You have Jerry Jeudy on the trade block. Denver already wants to run out Mike McGlinchey, the right tackle that they got in free agency. Like, it's a rough start. And it's interesting as well, Thomas, because, Sean Payton, it'll be interesting to see how this works. Sean Payton was never in New Orleans. They had 1 year, his second year, where they started 0-4. But when he joined in 06, it was Hurricane Katrina, playing games in San Antonio, moving on from Aaron Brooks to Drew Brees. Not a lot of expectations. Playoffs right away. First round bye right away. And mostly good to great football teams. They really, in New Orleans, never had football teams that were like last place teams, the way that this Denver team is right now. So it's a challenge for him too. And it's interesting. I'm excited to see what he can do when he has a chance to rebuild, but it's uncharted waters for Sean Payton as well, which will be interesting. Other uncharted waters, Thomas, I want to talk about this with you, the second part of this podcast. And it's similar stuff. In Carolina, you had an existing general manager in Scott Fitterer. They move on from Matt Rule. Matt Rule ends up going to Nebraska. They get some offsets there. They go ahead and get Frank Reich, who was a disaster in Indianapolis last year. A lot of tentacles to that, but most people who were working for Frank Reich, really respect him. Really a lot of positivity there. He goes to Carolina. Ejiro Evero goes with him to be the DC. It hasn't been that great for the Carolina defense either, personnel-wise. They get Bryce Young in the draft. Things have not been particularly good. I'm going to bring back up Sumersports.com so we can look at the offensive charts for the NFL this year. In fact, I want to look at the offense here for the Carolina Panthers. This is EPA per play. A lot of the normal suspects here at the beginning of EPA per play. But notice Carolina here is in the bottom, fourth of the league or fifth of the league here, minus 0.11 EPA overall. If you just look at the passing game, they're in a similar strait. If you look at the running game, also in the bottom fourth of the league in the NFL. So it has not been looking good when you look at players. Again, I'm trying to show off our website a little bit here. And you look at the bottom half of EPA guys. Now you're looking at, I'm looking for Bryce Young a little bit here. Andy Dalton's been okay. Bryce Young, I have to look here to find him. Do I have to load more, Thomas? He's in the load more category because he's the third worst in terms of EPA per play, just above Zach Wilson and Daniel Jones. That's not where you want to be. He's taking, now his sack rate isn't so bad, 8%. So there's some stuff to work with. But needless to say, it's been a struggle for Carolina. And so this week, head coach Frank Reich, for the first time in his career, has decided that he's going to hand off play calling duties to Thomas Brown, kind of a wonderkin, highly thought of quarterback coach, offensive coordinator. He's going to be calling plays. This is an interesting thing, right? Because we've seen head coaches who call plays in the past who have struggled avoid this move because it is kind of a release of power a little bit. And when you're thinking about, again, a dynamic where you're coming in, you're the new cock on the block, right? You're the new head coach, you're Frank Reich, and things don't start out great. You start to give away a little bit of power. How does that work in Carolina as far as what people are thinking and how they're looking at this thing at 0-6 right now with their first round pick given to Chicago next year?
Well, I think first, and I know what you're trying to say here. I mean, look, Carolina is in a rebuild situation, right? And we know from listening to Frank talk about the fact that he was going to have Thomas Brown in that situation sooner than later. What better time to do that than a bye week, right? That's an important time, give or take close to it. I think, we know, and you've said this many times, Frank Reich is a good football coach as a head coach. As far as taking power away, I really do believe when we hear Frank talk about, I was planning on doing this sooner than later anyway. And by the way, we drafted Thomas way back when, right? Georgia kid, love him, really smart. I really look forward to seeing what he's going to do. So I'm not being devil's advocate here, but I am kind of just cheering from the other side of this, saying, let's see what he can do. Right now, things are tough. Let's put the ball in his hand. Let's put the play sheet in his hand, and let's get him going, right? I mean, I think that's important. I think, my personal opinion is, I think the owner probably wants to see it. I think Scott Fitterer wants to see it. And I don't necessarily look at it as Frank losing power, because it's not like he's handing it over to someone and he has any risk of losing his job.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Frank Reich is here. He just came on board. He is established. Everything I've ever heard through people at in and around is that David Tepper really likes Frank Reich. So I don't think there's a challenge of insecurity or losing power. Let's figure this out. Let's start getting some freshness. And look, any head coach will tell you. I mean, look, I think you probably have the same conversation or might have the same conversation with Arthur Smith at Atlanta, right? Smart football coach. When is the time coming that someone's going to knock on his door and say, look, why don't you go back to, or not go back? Why don't you go to doing this?
Being the CEO of the on-field product, right? And I think that's, I mean, I think a lot of coaches struggle because the ideal guy, the Shanahan, the Reed, the Belichick, you know, the McVays are all good at doing both. But I think a lot, I mean, in my opinion, and I know Tomlin's called the defensive plays at times over the past few years, but in me, I think one of the best moves in the history of head coaching in the NFL, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, is Mike Tomlin was the defensive coordinator in Minnesota for 1 year, ran the Tampa 2, gets the job kind of surprisingly in Pittsburgh, and sticks with Dick LeBeau's 3-4 scheme and keeps Dick LeBeau there and builds himself up as one of the best kind of CEO kind of coaches in NFL history. I think there's wisdom in that, and there's wisdom in moving off of it. Somebody brought this up, and Sean's a really good listener to our show. Frank Reich was really sharp on fourth down stuff. Maybe the trend's back positive with giving up the play calling a la his protege Sirianni. Nick Sirianni gave up play calling in 2021 as well, and Shane Steichen emerged as a Super Bowl caliber play caller last season. And, you know, the risk is that guy is so good that he leaves and you might have to call plays again. But, like, there's a benefit, of course, of being able to be that CEO type coach.
Look, I go back to Dan Quinn for a minute, right? In 16 Super Bowl, the crazy historic loss in the Super Bowl, right? Dan Quinn, prior to the Super Bowl, we had demoted our coach, Coach Smith, another Coach Smith, who was our defensive coordinator, right? So Dan Quinn started calling our defense again all the way up and into the Super Bowl. And Dan will mention this. When that happened, think about this. I mean, this is like, we want to talk about raw on my world and in my gut. Yeah. And you know how I love Dan. Dan was calling. He was calling plays, Dan Quinn, all the way through that game, right? When Coach Shanahan was turned over, like, okay, man, you're the offensive coordinator down the stretch of this Super Bowl. I got to call this defense. Dan relies on Shanahan, of course, and he's down on the other side of the bench talking defense, and we run, pass. We're getting off on it here, but the interesting thing, if Dan might have been stepped back being the overall, head of everything and not play calling, might he have said to Kyle, stop, run, hit the damn ball. And it's hindsight is one thing. I'm using that as an example, and I've talked to Dan many, many times about it. It's not easy when you're relying on yourself to call the play and you're relying on your offensive coordinator, and an offensive coordinator might still have a little less bigger picture look. And that's a big conversation over many bottles of wine or whatever Eric Eager drinks.
Yeah, old fashions are my favorite, by the way. But to me, I agree. I think it's tough when you see as a leader, like there's a lot of value in being able to delegate, but there's also a lot of value in still having an eye on what's going on. Right. And I don't really want to bring up that Super Bowl much longer, but like there is sometimes you go back and think like, could this have gone differently? Could decisions have been made? Right. I mean, it's tricky when you think about it that way. And especially when, you go back in time, like no one knew that. I don't think anybody in the public knew that Dan was calling those plays. And right. So it's something of that ilk too, where it might not even come up in a press conference. It might not even come up in anything that could jar his sort of like worldview insofar as, Maybe I do need to have just one more eye on the in-game decision making and one more eye on special teams and that kind of stuff. So yeah, like I said, unless you can handle it, and even Andy Reid, Thomas, like I think Andy Reid sometimes struggles in the in-game stuff, and it's because he's so into calling the plays on offense.
In essence, what I'm saying is, not in no disrespect to your comments about losing power by not calling plays. I think there's almost more power in of itself being even above the play calling, right? Mm-hmm. Because you can say, no, or yeah, let's go ahead. So with Dan Quinn in that spot, I never thought he lost power. When we were going towards the Super Bowl, he was gaining more and more power within that building. And then he had to take it over because we were struggling a little bit on certain elements that he's like, I got to take this over. Yeah. So it became complicated.
Well, and it's similar as a general manager, right? Like if you decided, and there are GMs that do this. Like I remember Ted Thompson at Green Bay would actually do a lot of the scouting, and there were obviously value to that because of how good he was at evaluating talent. But like, imagine if you decided one year, like, oh no, I'm doing an entire region of scouting, like and like you're the rest of your GMing would take a hit. Like, let's be honest, like you're only one person that can only do so many things. And even if you delegated those responsibilities to other people, like we're all finite. We all come, with our limitations and stuff. And so, it's a good analogy, and that's good context for this situation. So Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to that point of Ted Thompson, God rest his soul, there are GMs out there, for everyone to know this, just a little bit of insight, who most of us were rising through the ranks as scouts, right? So we're used to being in the scouting room with 40, 30, 20 other scouts, watching video, writing our reports, going around to all the coaches, doing what we normally do as personnel people. As we climb the ladder, we do less of that. We still evaluate, Eric, right? We decide, okay, I'm going to take the top 100 players and I'm going to watch everyone else back at the office, right? So guys like Ted Thompson, though, he wanted to still live the life of a scout while he was being a GM, to your point, which is not easy. The GMs out there that still go out on the road and scout, Trent Baalke at Jacksonville, some of these guys, it's tough on them, but they still do it and they still lead their team. They put a lot of time in on their, on the road. And I think it's really important for a general manager to really sit down, know the power and the strength of their personnel departments, the personnel directors, their assistant GM, and make sure that they're doing over the top scouting instead of scouting like an old area scout, right? And that's a whole another topic in conversation that we should have, because I think it can shed a lot of really interesting information on how, the minutia of
that's maybe what we should do next week. In fact, I think, if I have my league calendar right, like we're probably getting to the time where we're going to start where you guys would, actually get to the nut cutting time about evaluating some college prospects. So maybe next Wednesday we talk about kind of where those big boards are forming, and when everybody overreacts to Caleb Williams throwing 3 interceptions against Notre Dame, maybe we talk about what that means in the context of kind of the league calendar and whether teams have made their decisions yet. This has been a lot of fun. I think this has been a great conversation. Before we go, for one, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, comment, send some. But every time you guys send a comment on YouTube or on iTunes or on Spotify, they get emailed to Thomas Dimitroff, and it makes Thomas happy. So keep doing it for the show. We are going to take one question. This is from Ryan Nielsen, a listener, frequent listener to the show. Going to fall weddings this weekend. Dr. Eric, what is the analytical consensus on fall weddings? Look, everything is about risk and reward. Thomas took a vacation with his family during the fall. I think sometimes it's necessary to do. And I got to be honest with you, the average noon game on a Saturday in college football isn't very good, right? And the average 3:00 game on a Saturday in college football isn't very good. And we all have cell phones. And I know I'm going to rant here for a sec. Hopefully, hopefully this is part stand-up, part football analysis. I've been to weddings in bum bleep Wisconsin where the service is bad. So I understand. I'm not speaking, too much about like, oh, you could have watched Washington, Oregon on your phone in the wedding. I get that. But by the time you get to 7:00 and you get to that reception, everybody's playing shout you're not required to dance the whole time. Get off to the bar and watch the one game that matters at 7 o'clock. You'll be okay. Fall weddings are fine. Fall weddings are fine. In fact, most people can get NFL Red Zone on their phone. So when you're driving back from the wedding the next day, you can just give your significant other the car. They drive. That's the price they pay for having you that weekend. And you watch Red Zone on your phone. It is perfectly tenable to have a fall wedding. I am pro fall wedding, and I don't think you should lose friendships over it. There we go. Don't forget your Big Ten roots. And why are you not locked into Minnesota? Yeah, exactly. You can video record Iowa, Minnesota if you want to watch a 17-12 game over again the next day. It is perfectly acceptable. Thomas, do I have it right, or I know if you actually work in the NFL, it's different. But if you are a fan of football, get over yourself. Go to the fall wedding. Enjoy your friends. There's only so many people in the world. Keep your friends.
There you have it. The Eager diatribe. I love it. I love listening to you go, because look, we get a chance to do that every once in a while at our offices, everyone. So I'm glad you guys got a feel for Eric's passion. Thank you.
So yeah, and I love football as much as anybody, but you gotta if you're gonna spend some Saturdays and Sundays watching 20 straight hours of football, you got to give your significant other a weekend or two. It just is how it works. So on that note, for Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been the Sumer Sports Show.